Good morning, guys. I hope you can see me and hear me. As usual, I would like for someone to just type something in chat to confirm whether or not you get the message, whether or not everything is clear. All right, I see the thumb up, so that's a good sign. Today we continue our conversation effectively about corporate level strategies. Last time we talked about what they are and what the benefits and potential drawbacks of diversification would be. Today we'll look at the same thing from a slightly different angle. Rather than discussing what it is and why do it, we're going to look at how to do it. And one thing that I've introduced last time is basically if you decide to diversify, if you decide to operate in more than one market or more than one industry, you have three options. You may try to develop these new capabilities organically, right? So you just effectively start a new business from scratch. And you hope that it is somehow related to what you currently do so that you may transfer some of your current capabilities into this new market or a new industry. And companies do that, but typically this is not the way to diversify, the way to manage their scope that most of them choose, especially larger companies. Larger companies are particularly strategic about operating in multiple markets. They are very serious about analyzing different industries, identifying attractive industries, again, by looking at those 5 forces of competition that we have discussed previously. And once they realize that these are the industries where we want to be, they look at alternative modes of entry into those industries or markets or geographies, right? Whatever the case might be. And typically they do that through either mergers and acquisitions or through different cooperative strategies. And today we're going to talk about both merger and acquisitions and cooperation as a way for companies to manage their scope. So again, I have to remind you that there are two fundamental questions in strategic management: managing the scale of the firm and managing the scope. So when we talk about the scale, this primarily has to do with business level strategies or competitive strategies, right? So either cost leadership or differentiation. In the first case, you do need the scale. In the second case, scale is really not your friend, but rather is your enemy. When we talk about managing the scope, right? So here we will look at different mechanisms through which you can develop your scope and manage your scope. And by far, the dominant way, especially for established companies, for incumbent companies to manage their scope, is by mergers and acquisitions. And let me get my slides up here. So I hope you can see that just fine. One second, guys. All right, never mind. So okay, so this way you should see everything. So with respect to some definitional issues, we need to talk about the differences between mergers, acquisitions, and takeovers. They effectively mean the same thing. So two or more companies become one, but how that happens differs. When we talk about mergers, we talk about the integration of equals. So typically when two companies truly merge, then both of them end their existence, and there's a new company being created, and shareholders in both old companies receive stock of the newly formed company. So it doesn't really matter if it adopts the name that is combination of both, but legally it is a separate entity, it's a new entity, and it just combines the assets of the two previously independent businesses. So that's merger. Acquisitions is probably the more popular way to acquire another company, to get control over another company. In the case of acquisitions, there's clearly an acquiring company and there's clearly a target company. And then acquiring company gets control over the target company. It doesn't necessarily mean that the acquiring company is larger than the target company. In fact, quite often it happens that the acquiring company, it maybe is just better off financially. Maybe it is more ambitious. Maybe it has some reasons to particularly desire entry into this market and they're willing to pay the premium. So they would take over a company that is larger than them in size. Multiple decisions may follow. Again, so initially they get a hold of the entire company, but they may split it into pieces. They may sell off the pieces that do not fit with their strategy later on. But the very process of acquisition is that you establish control over another company that has previously been independent. So if you are the acquiring company, your shareholders keep their stock. The shareholders in the target company, which is no more, right, which no longer exists, instead of their old stock, they get equity in the acquiring company, right? So the target company ceases to exist. Now it's just the acquiring company that legally operates. So that is the basic distinction between mergers and acquisitions. Beyond that, mergers and acquisitions are really, really similar. So the distinctions are really more legal than strategic. And then there's a very particular kind of acquisition that we need to look at a bit more closely, the so-called takeover. And this is when the acquiring company establishes control over the target company without the target company soliciting the bid. So you kind of do it against their wishes. And we may not necessarily talk about you getting 100% of their equity. You don't really have to control 100% of equity to establish control over a company. And in many cases, you don't need to control even 50%, right? It depends on how equity is spread among the shareholders. Sometimes having an equity stake of, 20 to 30% allows you to fully control the company. So, but the key takeaway here is there is this very particular kind of acquisition move called takeover. So in this case, the target company does not want to be acquired necessarily. So it may be neutral, it may have, it may not necessarily oppose the takeover, but it does not solicit the acquisition. There is no prior negotiation between the parties, so the acquiring company just establishes control over the target company. And there's a subtype of this approach, the so-called hostile takeover. This is in a case where the target company actually actively resists being acquired. But in this case, the acquiring company may always offer a premium on the equity of the target company and still establish control despite all the opposition from the part of the target company. So when that happens, there are certain implications, and we'll talk about them later on today. But it is important that you guys understand the similarities and differences between these three very important categories, or maybe four if you consider hostile takeover a separate category. Make sense? So again, the by far most important, most common strategy here is acquisition. Mergers are rare, hostile takeovers are kind of rare, acquisitions are anything but rare. What kind of acquisitions can we potentially be talking about? So first of all, we may talk about horizontal acquisitions. So here, the acquirer and the target company operate in the same industry. So effectively, you are acquiring your own competitor. And if you think about that, there may be many reasons for why companies do that. Definitely their resources and capabilities and strategies they pursue are likely to be similar. We've had a lot of that in the car industry, right? Auto manufacturer industry. where companies merge and acquire each other all the time. And the capabilities and the resources that they have are highly, highly similar. The idea here again is that if you acquire your own competitor, you look at their business very closely, you then identify the parts that do not belong because maybe that competitor is more diversified than you. Maybe the competitor operates in industries where you have no presence whatsoever. So you may restructure the acquisition target and sell all those pieces to someone else, to the highest bidder, or maybe let them just do the leveraged buyout and become independent companies. When you go through a horizontal acquisition, there are different kinds of synergies that you may expect. And this notion of synergy is extremely important. Unless there is a synergy, unless there is some unique value that the acquisition creates, it makes little sense to invest in the whole project. Because typically when you acquire a company, you pay a premium for the acquisition, right? There is the stock that is traded at the stock exchange. If you want to get control over the, that business that you seek to acquire, you have to offer a premium. That premium is only justified if there are some unique private synergies between your business and theirs that will sort of justify your paying that premium. And there are two primary sources of synergies that companies may look at. One is just cost-based synergies. So if you have acquired a competitor and your resources are similar, your strategies are similar, products are similar, it is very likely that you'll be using pretty much the same inputs. So, if you're manufacturing computers, both you and your competitor will be buying processors from Intel. There's just no other way. Well, maybe not Intel, maybe AMD, but in a nutshell, this is it. So if you have acquired a competitor and you've increased your own scale, all of a sudden your bargaining power vis-a-vis your supplier has grown. That gives you an opportunity to demand lower prices. If you maybe share some warehouses or some logistical networks, that gives you an opportunity to save on costs. So there are definitely certain cost-based synergies that may stem from acquiring your competitor, from a horizontal acquisition. There may also be revenue-based synergies, right? Once you acquired your competitor, you can actually be making more money off of the same sales. Why is that? Essentially for the same reason. If you operate in the same market and you have just eliminated the competitor, the concentration in that industry has gone up. You control a larger chunk of that industry that you sell to, or that market. And your bargaining power vis-a-vis your buyers also goes up. They have fewer competitors to possibly turn their attention to, and for that reason, you actually may expect to demand higher prices. So it helps you with costs. It potentially helps you with revenues. So there are clearly strategic benefits to consider horizontal acquisition. So that's one type. The second type is so-called vertical acquisition. So you remember vertical integration that we've discussed last time, and we said that companies sometimes decide that they need to build capabilities upstream or downstream along the value chain. So here you do not build those capabilities, you acquire the capabilities. You may choose to acquire your supplier, you may choose to acquire your buyer, and by doing that, you get closer to this final ultimate buyer that would be buying from the combined business. And that allows you to control additional parts of the value chain. Potentially, it may be interesting and beneficial as well. So it definitely insures you to some extent against industry dynamics that may differ from your business to the business you're about to acquire. So maybe if there's a economic crisis in your industry, but there's no crisis in the industry of your supplier, you may sort of smoothen out the negative effects of whatever is about to happen. I encourage you to remember what we discussed last week when we talked about vertical integration. So essentially, all those same benefits that we've discussed in vertical integration will apply to vertical acquisition as well. Sometimes it may be that you simply lack the capabilities that you need to succeed, and that the requisite capabilities could be found up or down the value chain. Kodak is one of those companies that has been discussed a lot in courses like this one, strategic management courses. It's a very old company, very well-known company with capabilities and essentially chemical processes. And up until fairly recently, up until digital photography, they had a very healthy strategy that allowed them to exploit market opportunities. So, they were manufacturing those films that you would use for photography and a whole bunch of related products. Once digital imaging came onto the scene, their capabilities in that market have effectively become obsolete. And they wanted to go into digital imaging, but they knew absolutely nothing about digital imaging. So rather than trying to develop those same capabilities themselves, they have chosen to acquire a startup that was rather proficient and effective in digital imaging technology. It did not work particularly well for Kodak, but at least, the attempt was there. So they clearly tried. Again, I believe we did mention this example previously, and it would have been a better strategic option for Kodak to completely refocus their market attention, to go away from imaging and just find a different application for its chemical know-how. They chose to stay with the sort of customers they thought they understood, the people who wanted some imaging products. And from everything we know about strategy, that was a major mistake. And the way that they have never been able to get back to the kind of performance they had earlier is a strong evidence of that strategic mistake. What we also know is that typically, whenever you acquire a company, especially if it's your supplier or buyer, right? So whenever we talk about vertical acquisition, the markets are really skeptical about the strategic outcomes. So it seems the only party that traditionally benefits from acquisition is the target company, because they receive the premium for being bought. The acquirer, the company who actually acquires this target, is being penalized by the market. So as soon as you announce the acquisition, your market stock most likely will drop. So that is a problem. This is something that requires a strategic attention, a lot of attention on the part of the top management team. They have to prove to the market that there are indeed benefits to this acquisition, that indeed those synergies could be reaped, and that puts a lot of pressure on the acquiring company to make sure the businesses are properly integrated and that they may operate effectively and create value in excess of what has been spent for the acquisition as such. So for the acquiring company, this is potentially problematic. And then whenever we looked at acquisitions, we may also say that some of them are related while others are unrelated. So when we talk about related acquisitions, we primarily talk about you acquiring a firm in a highly related industry. So they may not be your competitor necessarily. They may not be your supplier or buyer, but whatever capabilities are required to compete successfully there, you might have, right? Because the businesses are related to an extent. So I don't know what a distant example would be, but maybe if you are good in manufacturing furniture, you could also manufacture, I don't know, let's say you manufacture furniture for high schools. You may also go and start manufacturing furniture for some high-end restaurants. So that kind of stuff. The businesses are related, but you're not necessarily competitors, and you don't supply each other before. So you can transfer capabilities from one business to another, and that will justify this entire acquisition attempt. There are also surprisingly often unrelated acquisitions. So this is when the business that you're about to acquire has absolutely nothing in common with what you currently do. And when you engage in this strategy, effectively you're building a conglomerate, and conglomerates are by far the least successful kind of managing a scope strategy. So this is the least successful, this is the worst idea of them all. So if you are ever in the position to have a say as to what your company wants to do with respect to managing scope, advise against the unrelated acquisition. Bad idea. You will feel sorry, and there's absolutely no reason for you to consider it seriously. Now, what are the benefits of acquisition? We've identified some, but it makes a lot more sense to talk about them in more detail. First of all, it's increased market power, especially in the case of horizontal acquisition. So all of a sudden, your power against your suppliers, against your buyers will go up. Your buyers, all of a sudden they have fewer alternatives to turn to if they are not happy with your product. So that gives you an opportunity to demand higher prices, to offer fewer concessions. Basically, having power is a nice thing, right? As a strategy maker, you want to be in a position of power. The other clear benefit of acquisition is overcoming entry barriers. And this is important for entry into industries. This is also important for cross-border acquisitions. So you remember when we discussed industries and the fact that some are more attractive than others, we said that one force that really determines whether or not the industry is attractive and can sustain above average returns is threat of new entry. If the industry is such that it is not possible or extremely hard for a new competitor, for a new company to enter, then the only way that you can enter is by acquiring a company that already operates in that market. So an example would be in the United States, so lots and lots of college towns, they typically fairly small, so we talk about maybe 30, 40,000 people population. Of those 30, 40,000 people, probably half will be college students. And college students, being young and irresponsible, they like drinking. So for almost any bar that operates within that town where a college is located, business is almost guaranteed. Right, so of course you can still make a strategic mistake, you can mess up, you can really serve your customers poorly and they will punish you for that. But if you can sell booze to students, you have a captive audience, which would seemingly imply that a lot of companies would want to come in and start those kind of businesses. Well, it is not that easy. It's not easy because this kind of business requires a specific license from the state, maybe the state, maybe the county, so whichever the geographic unit that gives out those licenses. And there's typically a very limited number of those licenses available. So if you want to enter this town and establish a bar of your own to serve local clientele, the only way you can do it is by acquiring a company that already has that license. There's simply no other way. And so that then becomes a valid reason for acquisition. For cross-border entry, it could be that local governments are kind of protective of their own businesses. They do not necessarily encourage foreign companies to move in and start competing with their domestic folks. So what you have to do is if you want to operate in that business, again, you operate someone who already is positioned in the market that you want to go into. There may be other benefits of acquiring a company when you expand internationally, and we'll talk about that next week, I believe, when we talk about global issues and international strategies. But again, this is clearly justifiable. That makes a lot of sense. So by all means, do that. You may also acquire another company if you're interested in innovation, but you do not necessarily have a ready innovative product yourself at this time. So think about pharmaceutical companies, right? So they manufacture drugs. There are very fat profits in the drug industry. In fact, those profits are higher than for many drugs than illegal crack cocaine market, and there's been research to that effect. But if you want to get a new drug, if you want to develop it quickly, you typically would invest in a biotech company that has done the research, that has the product that is almost ready to go to the market, and you simply help them go through this multi-step approval process. Again, here I'm talking from the US perspective. To get the new drug approved requires a multi-step process, millions of dollars. There's this Food and Drug Administration that makes you jump through all sorts of hoops to get that approval. If you have the capability to get that approval, you may help the target company get the drug approved, and you may help yourself by establishing control over the drug that could potentially generate a lot of above average returns for your business, right? So the cost of new product development will go down and the speed to the market will go up. The other important thing is, we like talking about the importance of innovation and how you have to invest in research and development and support corporate entrepreneurship and all of those other wonderful things. The truth is, innovation is really unpredictable. So when you start a new innovative project, a new research and development project, there's absolutely no guarantee that you will end up with what you've been signing up for. And the history is full with examples of companies that have made incidental or accidental discoveries. So I don't know if you guys know sugar substitutes. So all the, Coke Zero and sugar-free drinks use those. The industry has effectively been created by a company that at the time it was a medical company, a biotech company rather, that was trying to develop a treatment for ulcers, right? So this is a condition with your stomach that is very detrimental. So they were looking for this. And of course, they have their scientists, and those scientists run a bunch of experiments and they get different compounds and nothing works really. And at some point, they receive this powder. And I don't know why, but one of the scientists decided to taste it. I'm sure it was against all the regulations. It's definitely unsafe to taste an unproven and untested product. And the scientist realizes that the stuff that they got is incredibly sweet. And more importantly, it does not have any bitter aftertaste. So up until then, let's say if you're diabetic and you cannot consume sugar, the only sugar substitutes that you had were like really poor quality. They would have bitter aftertaste, they would taste kind of weird, so they would not be really any comparable to what real sugar tastes like. So luckily, the guy in charge of the company at the time was certain Don Rumsfeld, who later on became Defense Secretary of the United States. He saw the commercial potential of that product immediately. And he said, forget about the medicine. Let's commercialize this product instead. So they were able to reach out to companies that were manufacturing soft drinks. They were able to establish very close relationship with those. And the rest is history. Eventually, this whole company, the technology, the know-how was bought by a company named Monsanto. which if you follow the sort of this critical journalism, is the company behind a lot of genetically modified products. So it's a very controversial acquisition. But again, the point is, when you start the innovative product or project, you have no idea whether or not you will succeed at the end. In fact, out of 100% of projects that are started, only about 16% ever result in anything useful. And only about 1% of all your innovation dollars results in a hugely successful innovative outcomes. So if you know that you need to innovate, if you know that you have to bring new products to the market and you're out of time and you really want something certain, it makes a lot more sense to acquire a company that already has a product almost ready that you would be able to take to the market, or that maybe has just introduced the innovative product itself already. And so then you establish control over that company, you help it bring the product to the market, you scale up the marketing campaign, and that's that. So that drives down your cost because you do not waste the money on something that may or may not happen, and it increases the speed to the market, which in a hyper-competitive age is definitely important, definitely beneficial. The risks compared to internal research and development are also much lower, because in most cases, when you buy a company for the sake of access to its technology, they already have a product, or maybe they have, at least a prototype, but you know exactly what you get with the money you spend, unlike your internal research and development. So that is a good thing. It helps you increase diversification, which, as we discussed previously, does have its benefits. It helps you reshape the firm's competitive scope, right? So not necessarily, just mere increase, but you can choose strategically where to go to. So you may seek industries that, if you operate there, will provide you with some unique synergies, what we call private synergies, that this acquisition will work for you better than it could for anyone else on the market. So by all means, you want to do that, right? Because then you will be able to reap unique benefits above what is expected by the rest of the market, and that would work for the rest of the market. So that is a good thing. And finally, acquisitions, they do allow you to develop new capabilities. Develop capabilities, learn capabilities, master capabilities, whatever you want to call them. And there are two ways of looking at that. One could be just, whatever capabilities your acquisition target has that now you've brought under your roof, under your umbrella, you can possibly transfer them from the target to your main business. That's one thing. Second thing, the very capability of acquiring other companies. This is something that does not necessarily occur naturally, right? This is something that requires work. This is something that some companies are better at than others. So if you develop that capability, then you will be in a better position to acquire others in the future than many of your competitors who have never done it. So it positions you advantageously. It gives you an upper hand when it comes to future performance. And because strategy is always, looking forward, having that capability that you would be able to employ in the future to establish above average returns is beneficial. So you want to do that, you want to pay attention to that, and this is the kind of capability that you'd rather have than not have. That said, obviously acquisition comes with a bunch of challenges. Nothing is ever free, so there are always costs associated with most strategic moves. And the probably most significant cost, most significant challenge here is integration difficulties. It is really very similar to the marriage. So you know that about 50% of marriages do not work out. The same exact thing happens with mergers and acquisitions. So you acquire a company, you believe there are unique synergies, you really feel good about each other. And then once you've acquired the company, then nothing seems to work. You argue all the time about stuff. Maybe your views on different things are incompatible. Maybe there are some money troubles. Maybe one of you likes to spend more than the other. Maybe one of you spends more than the other makes. So for all those reasons and cultural clashes, a lot of acquisitions fail to realize the benefits that were initially expected. The other very common challenge is the inadequate evaluation of target. So we have this effective market or efficient market hypothesis that basically tells you that what companies are valued at by the market represents their true value. And this is just a hypothesis, right? And in fact, we know that many companies are overvalued and some companies are undervalued. What it also means is that it's fairly difficult for you, especially if you operate in a different industry, to adequately assess what the company, what your acquisition target is truly worth. And you will probably heard examples of companies really attaining some spectacular valuations and then losing most of it in a matter of a few days, right? So the market correction. The problem is because you operate in a different industry or a different market, or because you don't really know the nuts and bolts of the company that you want to acquire, it may not be possible for you to adequately evaluate the target. And typically, if you are willing to pay for the company, you would be more optimistic about what it is worth to you than you should be. So you typically end up overpaying for the company. And here's why, here's how it works. If you make a mistake and you believe the company is less valuable than it really is, then no one will sell you the company for how much you're willing to offer. If you are accurate in your assessment, if you want to offer exactly how much the company is worth, why bother? Then you are not going to bring any profits to the people who currently own it. And that's that, right? So that there has to be some reason for them to really consider the transaction. Unless you offer a premium, there's probably no business that's going to happen. It is only if you are more optimistic with respect to the company's worth compared to the market, when people would be willing to sell the company to you. So the very fact that someone is willing to sell you the company at the price that you're willing to pay is actually, a trouble sign. It probably means that you are overestimating what the company would be worth to you once acquired. And again, even if you are correct at your assessment, then to have them sell, you still have to offer a premium. So either way you look at that, you tend to overpay. Not only that, very few companies get the kind of money, the kind of cash available to buy those acquisition targets. They have to borrow money to acquire companies. And when you borrow too much, obviously, maintaining the debt, servicing the debt, paying interest becomes a challenge, especially if the market is not super excited about the acquisition and your credit rating drops as a result of that acquisition. The natural implication is that the banks would want to charge you higher rates because you are not seen as a financially solid company anymore. They would be concerned, and as you know, poor pay more. Always, no exceptions, right? So if they see that you are a risky borrower, which you would be if you take on this huge debt to acquire a company for too high a price, they will charge you higher interest rates. which creates a lot of strain on the company and forces you to maybe consider strategic moves that otherwise would not be advisable. So that is a problem. And then you think that you know why you're buying this company. You think that there are those synergies that you would be able to achieve, and then you acquire a company and nothing happens, right? You're never able to integrate that business into your own properly. You're never able to transfer the capabilities that you expected to transfer. And, it turns out that the premium you've paid generates absolutely no value for the shareholders. Again, think about the auto manufacturer industry. At some point, there was this company called Daimler Chrysler. So Daimler-Benz, the manufacturer of Mercedes from Germany, has merged or acquired Chrysler, the US company. And Chrysler is not the best company. So really, Daimler did not want any of the technology that it could potentially acquire from Chrysler because the technology was inferior. And for Chrysler, importing the Mercedes technology was too expensive, right? Because the price point is very different, and the opportunities to benefit from this specific acquisition or merger never materialized. So they split again. So when you are unable to achieve that private synergy that you've anticipated, it is very likely that you will divest the company once again, most likely at a financial loss, which will have a negative strategic impact on your business. You may diversify yourself too much. And you remember that managing a diversified company comes at a cost. Remember, we talked about value reducing reasons for diversification, right? So CEOs and then basically top management team expects to get compensated at a higher level as a result of the acquisition. So if you grow too much, if you diversify yourself too much, then your costs, both financial and administrative, will go up. And strategically, that is not a good idea, right? You want to maintain your focus. You want to keep investing in those few capabilities and competences that put you aside, that set you apart from the rest of the competition. Now you have too many things on your plate. It's probably not possible to manage everything successfully and effectively. The other problem that those companies active in acquisitions may face is managers become overly focused on acquisitions. Why? Because acquisitions are fun. They don't want to do the regular day-to-day duties. It's a lot more interesting to, travel to wherever this new company is and spend some time looking at what they do, all the while not really doing what the company is paying for. So if you become overly excited by this acquisition target, it means you're letting go, you sort of letting down your current responsibilities. And businesses that are left unattended do not do very well. So you may be shooting yourself in the foot by sending your best and brightest people to try to integrate the acquired company under your fold. So that's an issue. And then you may simply become too large a company. So size matters, and managing larger companies is complex. We probably have talked, maybe not, maybe we'll talk about that later. So there are mental limitations to how many people you can manage. So typically anything above 7 people that you have to manage is too much. Right? You may probably do 10, but anything beyond that becomes problematic. If your company grows too large, then you have to institute all those extra layers of management to just make sure that people are not overwhelmed, that they still have the mental capacity to do what they're supposed to do, which slows the decision-making process down. it increases the cost. There are all those reasons to be wary of, focusing on acquisitions too much. Now, what about best practices? So we talk about the benefits, we talk about potential drawbacks. What do we know that works? First of all, you definitely want to acquire related companies, right? So no unrelated acquisitions, no conglomerate building. So that is a horrible idea. You want to acquire firms with complementary assets. So that's sort of rule number one. Rule number two is you do not want to engage in hostile takeover. So your acquisitions should be friendly. And from the business standpoint, you may wonder, what difference does it make? I need those assets, I acquire them, I show them who the boss is, and if they don't like it, they can leave it. And this is exactly what they can do. So if you acquire your target company in a hostile manner, most likely this will alienate the key employees in the acquisition target. So the best and brightest will not necessarily have too many troubles finding another opportunity for themselves. The people who will stay with your acquired company will probably not be the best and brightest, which is definitely a concern, right? So not only have you lost the people that are really productive, but you're also stuck with people that probably would cost you money to keep. And if you want to fire them, again, I'm not sure about other countries, but in the States, the laws are fairly strict. And it may not be easy or it may not be cheap to simply fire a person because you don't want him or her there. Right? So, of course, there are different situations and different forms of labor relationships, but that is definitely a concern. You're going to lose the best people and then keep the worst people. And if that's the case, then whether or not acquiring the business was a good idea is a big question. You always have to do the due diligence. So you always have to invest in really trying to understand the company, to assess the company, what it is worth, the kind of technology they have, the culture they have. So cultural fit is extremely important. And there have been many instances where you acquire a company that looks great on paper, that has patents that you kind of need, that has maybe geographic presence that you need. But because of how different the cultures are, the integration is problematic. So you want to make sure that you understand everything about the company. So you do this due diligence, you check everything that you should check, and probably then some, before you commit to the acquisition. You only do that when you have organizational slack, when you have some extra resources that you don't need for your day-to-day operations, especially if it is financial resources. Money is important, and you don't want to borrow to finance acquisitions entirely. So having slack is important. You don't want to be too deep in debt, right? So it's kind of like a mortgage when you buy a house. You want the mortgage to be comfortable so that you can service it without too much pain. So very important. And what rarely gets talked about, and what I want to emphasize here a lot, is that you should never forget your internal research and development. So we talk about the importance of innovation. We talk about the acquisitions and mergers often being driven by the need to innovate and bring new products to the market. And I get that, right? So you acquire a company that has a product that you bring to the market and everybody lives happily ever after, except your internal scientists, your internal engineers. Because what happens is when you buy a company, you need to use a lot of resources. These resources have to come from somewhere. And typically they come, right? So as we say here, you rob Peter to pay Paul. You underpaid your internal research and development to give this money, to spend this money on acquisition of another company that has some new technologies. So you strip away your internal people from resources. They are definitely going to be upset. They would not be able to do what they feel needs to be done. So that's bad in itself. You also give effectively their money to someone else. So it immediately creates those very hard psychological feelings towards each other. Uh, those people do not necessarily talk to each other nicely. There's competition, there is a very strong dislike. And what happens, and there's research showing that in about 2 years, since the moment you've acquired another company for innovative purposes, your internal ability to innovate worsens significantly. Let me repeat that. When you acquire other companies for the purpose of innovation or new product development, it only takes about 2 years for your internal research and development to become significantly less effective. So there may be different factors at play. Could be insufficient resources to do both. It could be organizational jealousy. It could be maybe most qualified people from your internal research and development leaving the company to where they know they will have enough resources. There are maybe many, many different factors at play. But in a nutshell, this is what you get. As you start acquiring other businesses for innovative purposes, your internal innovativeness, effectiveness goes down. And this is a very, very problematic sign. And obviously, you want to keep flexible, you want to keep adaptable. You understand that in many cases, what you plan initially, as with any plans, right? Once the first shot is fired, all the plans go down the drain. So you don't want to commit too strongly to a specific course of action. You need to maintain that flexibility. Now, since we talk about managing the scope of the company, right? So far, we talked only about acquiring other businesses, or managing the scope of your company up. You may also manage it down, right? So you may engage in what is known as downsizing, right? So maybe you've acquired another company, but you don't necessarily need 2 HR departments. So you let one of them go. Maybe you don't need 2 accounting departments. You let one of them go, right? So you downsize people, you downsize excess capacity. That's one thing. The other thing is that you may downscope, right? So this is directly managing the scope of the company. So you look at this overall entity that you now have, and most likely the business that you acquired, there was a reason for you to acquire it, but it has all those other pieces that you don't necessarily need. So you divest them, you sell them off, you allow those people, who work in those businesses to maybe buy themselves out of your control. So you start downscoping. Now, with respect to downsizing, here in the States, people like euphemisms a lot. They don't like calling it downsizing. They call it the right sizing, right? So you just maintain whatever you really need for the company, but it doesn't really change what it really is, right? So it's downsizing. And leverage buyouts, again, as I said, sometimes you just allow people who are in charge of a specific chunk of a business to buy themselves out. So they would possibly write some management buyout. They will borrow some money, they will buy themselves out, and over time they will repay the debt to whoever lent them the money. And there could be private equity firms that do that. Again, it's not terribly important for us here. What I want to emphasize is that when we talk about managing the scope of the company, it's not just thinking about increasing the scope, enlarging the scope. It is also the selective trimming of the company and maybe letting some pieces of the company go if they do not fit with the overall strategic agenda that you have. So that is essential. And now here's this other thing that you may do to manage the scope of the company. And it is very interesting, and I think we'll be seeing more and more of it in the near future. It turns out you don't even have to acquire a company to get all those same benefits we discussed when we talked about acquisition. You may simply engage in some sort of cooperation with a completely independent company and get those same kind of benefits that you typically expect from acquisition. In fact, you get more benefits, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. So the types of cooperative arrangements, two major kinds, right? We talk about either alliances or networks. When we talk about alliances, it typically means just two parties, right? So two independent entities, they either create a joint venture, or they create a strategic alliance proper, or they may create, the so-called non-equity strategic alliance. So what's the difference? In a joint venture, you set up a third company. You set up a company that hasn't existed before. You own part of it. Your partner, your strategic ally owns a part of it. And then together through that company, you try both to achieve your goals. And they may be those same goals, right? The market power, new product development, speed to the market, entry into certain geographic markets or industries, whatever the case might be. With equity-based strategic alliance, effectively you exchange your shares with your ally, with your partner. So now you own some chunk of his business, and they will own some chunk of your business. And this way, it's almost like a family. Now you're on the same page. Whatever is good for them is good for you, and vice versa. So you start working together, and hopefully, that makes everybody happy and live happily ever after. Non-equity strategic alliance is you simply coordinate your efforts. It is based on trust. You do not exchange any equity. You do not set up an independent company. You simply coordinate your efforts. And there's a very fine line between this non-equity strategic alliance and collusion, right? So collusion like price fixing, when companies that work in the same industry agree among themselves that, they're going to charge this much for this product. From the competitive standpoint, this is a violation. If you're caught doing that, there will definitely be sanctions, and you may end up getting out of business and possibly facing some criminal persecution. So what is allowed and not allowed to do here, you have to pay very close attention to. And, potentially this is beneficial, but not quite straightforward as many people think. There's this other way of getting cooperative benefits, and this is the so-called networks arrangements. So here we talk about many more companies than just two. And typically when we talk about networks, we talk about networks of small and medium-sized firms. So I'm pretty sure you guys have heard of clusters, right? So this is the same idea, just different name for it. So in many European countries, they use the notion of clusters. In the United States, they tend to call them networks. What it is, in effect, is a bunch of companies, anywhere from, 5 to maybe 30, that typically work in the same industry and typically operate in the same geography, decide to coordinate their efforts, to pool their resources, and start working on some products or projects together. So it is very, very pronounced in the Scandinavian countries. In fact, over a third of all startups that are created there join those networks right from the beginning. And the idea is, right, so you maintain your independence. No one can tell you what to do You don't have to work with every partner in every network, and you can belong to more than one network if you want to, but you maintain your independence, you maintain your flexibility, yet you do get the chance, you get this easy platform to cooperate with companies that otherwise would be competing against you. So you may still compete with those companies in other markets, but then there are areas where you choose to cooperate. And maybe you have heard the term competition. So this is like a cooperation and competition at the same time. So it's the cooperation of competitors. This is becoming very, very prominent. Again, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, really big deal over there. Not only that, the governments in the Scandinavian countries have actually followed a very specific policy. They believe it is in the government's best interest to give some money to those networks to help them work together on developing innovative projects. And the idea here is very simple, right? It is best for us to help them so they don't go out of business and so they don't have to apply for unemployment, right? We give them a little bit of money, they stay employed, and we don't have to spend a lot of money to pay their unemployment benefits. We do not talk here about millions of dollars. The amounts are fairly insignificant, but it provides enough of a difference to those startups to be able to initiate different projects. And what it also does, it allows them to coordinate their efforts so that they're able to compete against larger companies, right? So as I said before, size matters. And, having a larger size gives you more bargaining power against your buyers and suppliers. If you are an independent small company and there's a large competitor in the same geographic area, you're probably doomed, right? At some point, that company will probably simply acquire you, or maybe even just see you go out of business, and that's that. When you create this network, when a lot of companies in the same industry, in the same geography, coordinate their activities, all of a sudden those larger guys feel very uncomfortable because now you can't compete. Now you can't put the same kind of pressure on buyers and suppliers. So it actually increases your survival. So that is a very, very good thing for you to do strategically. Those networks could be stable or dynamic. Stable networks, so typically combine the same partners from project to project, from year to year. In fashion design in Italy, they are extremely prominent, right? So they are known for that specific industry in Italy. And there are all those independent companies, fairly small, that have been working together sometimes for decades without mergers or acquisitions. So they appreciate the freedom. They appreciate the ability to, be their own bosses. Yet when it comes to cooperation, they choose to do it. So that's a good thing. You manage your scope without committing to anything, that is long-term and that can put you in a very disadvantageous position. There are also dynamic networks, and those are very prominent in the information technology sector. So here, your partners will change from project to project. Yes, you are still in the same industry, you are still in the same geography, but who you work with depends a lot on the nature of the project. So there is nothing fundamentally different between these two kinds of networks. And, maybe as they evolve, maybe there will be more convergence between them, but some of the implications for how you manage those networks will naturally differ. And if we have some time at a later point, we may discuss that if you guys are interested. In terms of benefits of cooperation, again, quite similar to everything we've talked about before. The kind of benefits that make most sense to look at will depend on the type of market you're dealing with. So if you happen to be in a slow cycle market, then typical benefits of cooperation would include access to a restricted market, maybe franchise in a new market where, you can afford to play with such new ideas. Market stability, establishing standards, right? So you want to cooperate to establish a technological standard, dominant design that will later on see you to your success. So I believe we did talk about dominant designs previously, right? And Blu-ray, HD, DVD, all of that kind of stuff. So it makes a lot of sense for businesses to pool their efforts together to reach the common goal. If you happen to be in a fast cycle market, then the primary reason for cooperation would be to speed up research and development or new product development and market entry, right? So the things that we've discussed before previously when we talked about acquisition. It helps you maintain market leadership. It helps you, again, form technology standard. You share risky R&D expenses, right? We said previously that innovation process is not really predictable. So, if you have multiple parties working on that same project, then you share risks, and that's a good thing. It helps you overcome uncertainty. In what way? Right? So if there's a project that you want to undertake and you are the only company, it's easy for you to make a mistake. If you have multiple partners and all of them agree that this project is great, right, that it has huge benefits, then your uncertainty is reduced. If everybody agrees, chances are it is good indeed. If you feel excited about the project and no one else likes it, then probably it's a good idea not to listen to your gut and go with what the rest of the network suggests, right? So there are unexpected benefits to this cooperation as well. And then in standard cycle market, again, we primarily talk about market power, access to complementary resources, economies of scale. If you coordinate with companies operating in the same industry, which is often the case, dealing with trade barriers, meeting challenges from competitors, especially when those competitors are of larger size, and so on and so forth. So, I think the rest of it, I'll just direct you to the textbook, read about it there. And let me remove my slides. Do you guys have any questions? Any questions on anything we've covered today or the previous week? You may talk to me, you may type something in the chat. So it seems that so far you guys are fine and have no questions. If that's the case, thank you so much. Next week will be a little bit different arrangement. I have some prior commitments, so I will not be able to spend this time with you in real time. I will pre-record a video lecture, and then I will have people just make my pre-recorded video lecture available to you in time so that you'll be able to watch it and be fully prepared for your case discussions. And I think that is probably the only difference. Otherwise, I know that there are some projects coming, exams coming, so keep active, keep at it, and if you have any questions, you have my email. All right, let me see. And there's a question here. You've mentioned that banks require a higher interest rate to be paid by companies that take large amount of debt. Why is it so? Can you explain, please? Yes, of course. Because if you borrow a lot of money, then this is riskier for a bank, right? There's a higher chance that you will not be able to pay it off. Like when you buy a house, and again, I have never bought a house in Russia, but I had this experience in the United States. They look at your income, they look at how much of a house you can possibly afford. If you can put down, right, so your first payment, if you can give them 20% in what the house is worth, that's called down payment, then they consider you a low risk investment they can give you decent rates. If you can only put down 5%, right? So you need to borrow more than 80% of what the house was worth, then to the bank, you are a risky borrower. They will either give you higher rates or they will make you to pay for insurance so that they feel safe, the bank feels safe. Like if you cannot service your debt, you will then use your insurance to pay the bank so the bank doesn't lose the money. So the banks are very conservative. They understand that for those who borrow more, the risks are higher, the chance to lose the money is higher, and the only way for them to hedge against it is by charging you a higher interest rate. It's very simple. You get the best interest rate if you actually do not need their money. So then they will actually be chasing after you, trying to offer you personal loans, professional loans, business loans, whatever the case might be. So that's always the case. All right. Any more questions? If not, then I will see you in 2 weeks. And again, if between now and then anything happens, feel free to contact me and I will be happy to deal with whatever issue comes up. Enjoy your week, guys. Bye.